The knock on the door came just as I had started to lose myself in the moment. A soft, hesitant knock, barely audible over the sound of my own pulse pounding in my ears. At first, I thought I had imagined it, a figment of guilt conjured by a restless conscience. But then it came again. "Jess? Are you in there?" It was my brother's voice, muffled and uncertain, but unmistakable. My breath caught, panic knotting in my chest. My hand froze mid-reach, every nerve in my body suddenly aware of the precariousness of the situation. What was he doing home, so early? My mind raced for answers, excuses, anything that would explain why I wasn't alone. In that instant, I realized there was no hiding. No way to untangle myself from the web I'd spun. And, to my surprise, I wasn't sure I wanted to. My name is Jess, and I suppose if you asked anyone who knew me, they'd say I was the dependable one. The one who played by the rules, who smoothed out the wrinkles in everyone else's chaos. But as I stood there, heart hammering and shirt half-buttoned, I realized how fragile that image really was. It started a few months back, after my husband, Ethan, started working late nights. He claimed it was for us, for the future we were building together. At first, I believed him. I wanted to believe him. But it didn't take long for the silences between us to stretch too far, for his absence to start feeling like neglect. The house felt colder, emptier. That's when Nathan came into the picture. Nathan was my husband's best friend, of all people. He was the kind of man who carried warmth with him, charming, attentive, and with this maddening way of making you feel seen, like really seen. He wasn't like Ethan, who had grown comfortable in his distance. Nathan noticed when I changed my hair, asked about my day like he actually cared about the answer, and laughed at my jokes like they were the funniest thing in the world. Our connection started innocently enough. He'd come by to check on me when Ethan was pulling yet another late shift. A quick coffee turned into an hour-long conversation. Then 2 hours. Then, one evening, his hand brushed against mine, and something electric passed between us. Before I knew it, we were meeting in secret. At first, I wrestled with the guilt, the betrayal. But then I'd see Ethan come home, barely acknowledging me, his head buried in his phone, and I'd feel the bitterness rise like bile. I told myself I deserved this, someone who made me feel alive again. Which brings me to now, to this suffocating moment of truth. The bedroom was dim, the air heavy with the scent of lavender candles I'd lit earlier in some desperate attempt to create an atmosphere of calm. The bed was unmade, sheets tangled for more than just restless sleep. Nathan stood a few feet away, his shirt untucked, face pale with the realization that we weren't alone. And on the other side of the door, my little brother, Tyler. At 19, he was supposed to be out with friends, living his carefree college life. Instead, he'd come back early, walking into a scene I couldn't explain away. This wasn't just about me anymore. The stakes had shifted, and the fragile web of lies I'd spun was about to snap. "Jess?" Tyler's voice was louder now, firmer. My little brother had always been polite to the point of shyness, but there was an edge in his tone I hadn't heard before. "Just a second," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. My heart was hammering, the sound roaring in my ears. Nathan shot me a look, part panic, part apology. "What do we do?" he whispered, his voice tight. I didn't have an answer. My mind was spinning, grasping for something, anything, that could salvage this. Tyler wasn't a kid anymore. He wasn't going to buy some weak excuse about why I had a man who wasn't my husband standing in my bedroom looking like he'd been caught red-handed. "I'll handle it," I whispered back, trying to sound confident, though I felt like I was about to collapse. I straightened my shirt and moved toward the door, my hands trembling. When I opened it, Tyler's expression hit me like a punch to the gut. His face was a mix of confusion, disappointment, and something worse, recognition. His eyes darted past me, and I knew he'd seen Nathan. "What's going on, Jess?" he asked, his voice low but laced with something sharp. "Why is he here?" I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. How could I explain this? How could I tell my brother, the kid I'd practically raised after our mom passed away, that the sister he looked up to was a hypocrite? Nathan stepped forward, his voice calm, like he was trying to defuse a bomb. Tyler, it's not what it looks like. Tyler laughed bitterly, the sound cutting through the tension like a knife. Really? Because it looks like my married sister is hooking up with her husband's best friend. But please, enlighten me. Tyler, please, I started, but he cut me off.
No, Jess. Don't please me.
His voice cracked, and I saw tears welling in his eyes. I thought you were better than this. I thought. He shook his head, as if trying to clear the thought. How could you do this to Ethan? He loves you. The words hit me harder than I expected. Did Ethan still love me? Or was Tyler clinging to an image of our marriage that had crumbled long ago? Nathan tried again, stepping forward. Look, it's complicated. Tyler turned on him, fury blazing in his eyes. Don't. Just don't. You're supposed to be his friend. How could you? I'm sorry, Nathan said quietly, his voice heavy with guilt. I wanted to scream, to make them both stop talking. Instead, I stood there, caught between shame and anger. It's not that simple, I finally said, my voice trembling. You don't know what it's been like, Tyler. You don't know how lonely I've been. Lonely's? Tyler snapped. So that's your excuse? You just throw away your vows because you're lonely? Do you know how many people would kill for what you have? My throat tightened.
You don't understand.
Ethan, he's not the same. He's not, I trailed off, realizing how hollow the words sounded. Not what? Perfect? Newsflash, Jess, no one is. That doesn't mean you get to blow up your whole life. Tyler's voice broke, and the tears he'd been holding back finally spilled over. Seeing him like that, angry, hurt, and so deeply disappointed in me, was almost unbearable. I didn't mean for this to happen, I whispered, tears stinging my own eyes. Yeah, well, it did, he said bitterly. And now what? You think this guy, he gestured at Nathan, is gonna make you happy? What happens when he gets bored, huh? Then what? Nathan flinched, but he didn't argue. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I wanted to tell Tyler he was wrong, that Nathan was different, that this wasn't some fleeting thing. But was it? Could I even trust my own feelings anymore? Slipping out the door without another word. As I stood there, alone in the deafening silence, I realized I had no idea how to pick up the pieces of what I'd just shattered. Finally, Tyler shook his head. You're not the person I thought you were, he said quietly, his voice heavy with disappointment. Then he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there with my world crashing down around me. Nathan reached for my hand, but I pulled away, my chest aching with a pain I couldn't name. You should go, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Jess. Just go, I said, more firmly this time. He hesitated, then nodded. The house was quiet that night, the kind of silence that felt alive, pressing against me with unrelenting force. Tyler hadn't come back after our confrontation. I'd called him, left voicemails, but he hadn't responded. Nathan had texted once, asking if I was okay, but I hadn't replied. I didn't know how to face anyone, least of all myself. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the remnants of a dinner I hadn't touched. The overhead light buzzed faintly, and the clock on the wall ticked too loudly, both sounds amplifying the weight of my thoughts. How had I let it get this far? How had I become the person I'd always promised myself I wouldn't be? The sound of the front door creaking open broke the stillness. I turned, half hoping it was Tyler. Instead, Ethan stood in the doorway, his tie loosened and his eyes dark with exhaustion. You're still up, he said, his voice neutral. I couldn't sleep, I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. He walked into the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water, his movements slow and deliberate. There was a tension in his shoulders, a heaviness in the way he carried himself that I hadn't noticed before, or maybe I'd just ignored it. Tyler called me. he said finally, his back still turned to me. The words hit me like a physical blow. What? My voice cracked, my chest tightening. He turned to face me, his expression unreadable. He didn't give me details, but he said I should come home, that we needed to talk. I felt the blood drain from my face. Tyler hadn't just left to cool off, he'd gone straight to Ethan. Ethan, I started, but the words caught in my throat. He held up a hand, cutting me off.
Don't.
Just don't. His voice was calm, but there was a rawness beneath it that made my stomach twist. The silence stretched, heavy and unbearable. Finally, he sat down across from me, his eyes searching mine. Is it true? He asked. I wanted to deny it, to salvage whatever fragments of our marriage still remained, but the lie wouldn't come. My throat felt like it was closing, my chest tight with guilt and shame. Yes, I whispered, the word barely audible. He closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. When he opened them again, there was a sadness in his gaze that cut deeper than anger ever could. Why? He asked, his voice breaking. Was it something I did? Something I didn't do? No, I said quickly, shaking my head. It wasn't you. Or maybe it was. I don't know. You've been so distant, Ethan. You're never home, and when you are, it's like I don't exist. I felt invisible. Invisible, he repeated, his voice bitter. Jess, do you think I'm working these hours for fun? I'm trying to build a future for us. For you? I didn't ask for that. I snapped, the words spilling out before I could stop them. I didn't ask for you to disappear into your job. I just wanted you. Here. With me. He looked at me, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. And Nathan? Was he just filling the void? Or was it more than that? I hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on me. I don't know, I admitted finally, my voice trembling. Maybe he was. But it wasn't about him, Ethan. It was about how I felt, how I stopped feeling like I mattered to you. He looked away, his jaw tightening. Do you even want this marriage anymore? The question hung in the air, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. Did I? I thought about the years we'd spent together, the love that had once been so easy, so certain. I thought about the distance that had grown between us, the cracks that had gone unspoken. And I thought about Tyler, about how his disappointment had forced me to see the person I'd become. I don't know, I said finally, my voice breaking. I don't know how to fix this. Ethan nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Neither do I, he said. Then, without another word, he stood and walked away, leaving me alone with the truth I'd spent months avoiding. I wasn't sure if I could fix what I'd broken, or if I even deserved to try. The next morning, Ethan was gone before I woke up. A note sat on the kitchen counter, short and painfully neutral. We'll talk later. Need some space. The emptiness in those words cut deep, but I couldn't blame him. Space was probably the only thing we had left to give each other. I spent the day in a haze, replaying every moment of the last few months, every choice that had led me here. The guilt was overwhelming, but so was the realization that this had been a slow unraveling, not a single thread pulled loose. Somewhere along the way, we'd stopped talking, stopped trying. And I'd chosen to seek solace in someone else rather than confront the truth. Tyler finally texted me that evening. I don't know what to say to you right now, but I'm not ready to lose you either.
Give me time.
It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. As the hours crept by, I thought about Ethan, about the man I'd fallen in love with, and the man I'd hurt. I thought about the look in his eyes when he asked if I wanted this marriage, and how I hadn't been able to give him an answer. Maybe because I didn't know the answer myself. Nathan texted once more. I'm sorry for everything. Let me know if you need me. I stared at the message for a long time before deleting it. Whatever this thing with him had been, it wasn't the answer. It never had been. That night, as I lay in bed, the silence felt different, less like a punishment and more like a mirror. It forced me to look at myself, at the choices I'd made and the person I'd become. I don't know if Ethan and I will find our way back to each other. I don't know if Tyler will ever look at me the same way again. What I do know is that the path forward starts with honesty. No more excuses, no more running. Sometimes, love isn't enough to save a relationship. But maybe, just maybe, it's enough to save the people inside it.